Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of the Self Improvement Project. It is the 3-year episode where my good friend Dan has joined me for an hour or so to reflect upon, to discuss, to explore the Self Improvement Project so far. As you'll all know from the way I talk about the podcast and the project, it's not going to end anytime soon, hopefully never. But we spend a good bit of time exploring what led up to the self-improvement project, how the project has gone so far, and things that have come from it as well. We talk about the power of simpler living, the power of moulding, sculpting ourselves throughout this journey, and the importance of understanding what richness in life means to you. So, no ads today, no pushing anything today, just purely celebrating 3 years of an independent project that yourself has spent a little bit of your life digesting and listening to. So as always, guys, thank you for making this project what it is. The messages you send, the updates you send, and just purely by being involved, it means the world to me. So take this moment to enjoy 3 years of the podcast and reach out to me if you've got any questions. Enjoy. Okay, cool. So time of recording, we're about 10 days, I think, away from the actual 3 years, which is wild. Nice. From COVID, from just starting the podcast once a week. We're on to year 3.
Do you remember when you started it? Like the first, do you remember the first kind of
first
podcast?
episode? The first episode, I remember when I did 20s leadership back in 2018. I remember I started with 3,
Yes.
and then I did that.
I forgot.
I remember
about
the start of that. The first episode of the Self-Improvement Project, I think it was just an introduction one. I do remember it. My favourite part about it was, obviously there was no theme tune, which was the first year as well.
Yeah.
So it's just straight into me talking.
Down to business, right?
Yeah, I use the 20s leadership as a bit of an in. We're picking it up again, we're renaming, we're rebranding. And then I tried to say the title, the Self-Improvement Project, and I stumbled and I stuttered. And I was like, oh great, this is the perfect example of how far we can take this.
So in reality, really, because like I said, I completely forgot about the 20s leadership stuff. So you've actually been doing this longer than 3, obviously Self-Improvement Project for 3 years, but
officially,
just podcasting in general, you've been doing it for even longer, which is class.
Yeah, it's a nice kind of into the mastery side of things, which I think whenever someone has something that is perceived or deemed successful, is that you started it on this date, we're talking about 3 years, but I used to do those podcasts back in 2018. I did it for a few months, but you'll remember before that I used to do video stuff on Facebook where I would talk about personal development stuff. I would try and do little posts around that as well. And then the first ever venture thing I actually did was 2016 when I was doing football coaching.
Right.
I tried to do loads of stuff with that. And that was great as well, because you learn so much about doing your own project, what lands, what you're trying to do, what you're comfortable with, finding your way, and things like that. But you look back and you cringe, obviously, and you feel embarrassed, but it's all part of where we are now. And just I think of the 20s leadership podcast, and you'll know because we talk about it, but you see the listens come in and you get excited about the numbers of things that come in and roll in. And even you think back then and these moments of I remember I stopped the 20s Leadership podcast because I got this new job and stuff. So I was focusing on that. And I was like, I've got like 800 listens from this podcast that I just did for a few months. And I was like so proud of that. And I remember saying to you, I was like, if we pick this up, should I delete it? Should I start it again? You're like, just keep it. Let's just see what happens and stuff.
So this is really like 3 years where we're at now. This is really like the culmination of a variety of different projects, right? From 2016. So
yeah,
it's exciting.
actually
And you mentioned like numbers and stuff, right? Like 800 kind of listens on 20s leadership stuff, and then you kind of look at the stuff that you're kind of picking up now in terms of numbers, and it's wild. Like just kind of seeing that difference is fascinating. That's interesting. Like, be interested to kind of hear your thoughts on that kind of progression numbers wise. Like when you started Self Improvement Project, because I know when you started, I think you had done it on SoundCloud. And then you moved to Spotify, right? I think SoundCloud numbers were decent. You could see kind of where people were coming through from, where they're listening from. Numbers were solid, and then you moved to Spotify, and it just seemed like there was an instant kind of jump in terms of the amount of people listening, the countries that people were listening from, and it makes me kind of think like that is not a natural jump going from one thing instantly to the next, and that your numbers actually for SoundCloud would have been way more impressive than they actually were in what they were reporting, right?
Yeah, I think, you look at the analytics and you think that can't happen in the space of just changing platform side of things. But I mean, like everything that we're talking about, and we will, is like it's all like a metaphor or like life lessons for other things as well, isn't it? Like I did SoundCloud on that platform with I don't want to say like low expectations because I enjoyed the thrill of hitting like a certain number, but you have limited expectations because you're starting this thing. You have all these elements of self doubt. Is it actually that good? All those sort of things, but you're just continuing it because you enjoy doing it, and then switching to something and seeing different analytics that give you a truer representation of the impact that you're having. It validates you, but it's like anything. These are moments, and now and you always adapt to those feelings, don't you? And it's that feeling of more that you want. So
yeah, well, that's the thing. Like you would have kind of started with the Self Improvement Project, like looking to kind of obviously make an impact, kind of essentially like touch people with what you're saying, right? And you would have had like numbers in mind as to what you want to reach. And now you've probably like way surpassed that from your initial kind of expectations, right? But now you'll also be thinking about, right, okay, what next? What's the next goal? And I think it does, what we kind of spoke about earlier in the week, it does come back to just essentially, like being content with what you've got and appreciating what you have, right? Because if you look back at your kind of yourself 3 years ago, like you've achieved what you set out to achieve. So it's taken time to acknowledge that and just be happy for it.
yeah, it's endless. I know it was something that we talked about, that it was a bit of a thought around this episode and that perception of the 3 years, but these are just moments. They're just these highs. They're those hits that you get, and then you're like, right, okay, what's next? And I think if you surround yourself with people online and you see, it's amazing the access that you get to some of the most successful people in the world, and even they're like not even happy with everything that they've got. So I think there's a it could be a bug or a feature that we use, but you look back with the classic gratitude of, oh, look at everything that I've done and I've managed to achieve, or there's the nagging doubt of, oh, what more could I do, or what more could I get? And it's a constant battle, isn't it?
It's never ending. I think that's just the kind of like culture that we find ourselves in, right? I think we're constantly kind of yearning for more. And I fully kind of count myself within this bracket, by the way. But you yearn for more, and I think that kind of yearning does get in the way of appreciating the moment and appreciating what you've achieved, celebrating that, just being happy for it. Because yeah, like I said, you have set out what you want to achieve, and it's just taking time to enjoy it.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm just going back to a conversation I was having last night with some of our pals when we were out for dinner, and just, people are really nice about the podcast, and I think, impressed that I've kept up for so long, because I was talking about 3 years, and like, it still blows my mind in a really good way that I can go and look at the analytics or the stats of things, and I can see that, like, there's been hundreds of listens in a day. And it would be very easy now, after 3 years, to be like, oh, I should be getting more than that. And it's just about, again, rebalancing, like, where you're at, your thoughts, your perception around, like, I'm really, really grateful to have hundreds of people choosing to press play on the podcast every single day.
Well, it's like being present, right? It's what you kind of constantly hear, being present, being kind of mindful. And yeah, like the thought, and this blows my mind as well, because I know you like said making of like updates in terms of numbers and listens and stuff, but it still blows my mind that there's folk that kind of take time out their day on a consistent basis to listen, and they're properly kind of impacted, positively impacted by it. That in itself, I think, is just that's like a beautiful thing by itself. That would be great on a one-off basis, but this is consistent. This is like numbers consistently, and this is for like people all across the world. You've got folk, naturally, kind of like family and friends that listen. You've got folk in essentially, I think, like every continent. I think from what you've said to me, I don't think there's like one continent that you've not touched, which is fascinating, and it's great. Like, it does make me kind of think. Imagine thinking about this, even like 20 years ago, it just wouldn't be a thing.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to.
Yeah, the ability to kind of like, essentially speak your thoughts into a computer, put that out to the world, and people across the world can listen to it.
Yeah.
Nuts, isn't it?
And I think it's really nice permission for folk to have as well, if it's a form of self-improvement or a form of self-development for people that they feel, I essentially started this again 3 years ago because I had an itch to, like, I have to. I really like people like Derek Sivers and Kevin Kelly who talk about you have to feed that creativity that you have, or feed that impulse that you have to serve, what, we can use terms like purpose, mission, vision, all these sort of things, but it is essentially like a calling that you have to turn up and do something to feel like you're, again, serving yourself. You're actually, it might sound a bit morbid, but like, you're not going to the grave leaving any like stones unturned. You're making sure that everything that you're supposed to give out into the world is there. And, again, it might seem really beyond, but something that I really like that you were saying as well is that this podcast is, we could talk about it outliving me, but the fact that we've got 3 years worth of episodes that will just be there forever. They'll be out there and people can dive in there forever is great. And I think, it is really good to have that permission to just turn up and feed whatever you want to do in your own way, find what you like, turn it into a form of play, turn it into a form of enjoyment for you. When I talk to other people like what we're doing just now and we just chat about each other's projects and stuff, there's always that question of, oh, like, have you ever like given up or stopped, and there's always this talk about enjoying it, loving it, and I think it's a balance, isn't it? It's like work, it's like a job. You want to do something that serves you and feels good, but you also want to do something that you don't always want to go to work.
Yes.
There's like a balance there as well, and it's good for you. You know that it could be engaging and stimulating, and it'll develop you, but you need to push yourself. And it's the same with things like this as well. But there's an element of enjoyment that comes with the pain of, the past few weeks I've been doing a podcast episode every day and then scheduling it. And as much as I absolutely love the fact that I'm like, wow, I've created so much or I've done so much, there's a pain every time I turn up to do it and hit record and go like, right, I'm actually committing to recording this now, not knowing how good it's going to be or not knowing if it's going to sound the same as all the other episodes I've done and all these sort of things as well. And I think there's an element of like committing to that fear that,
yeah. Well, it's like the way I kind of see it is like, you're turning up, like there's no one else involved in this, right? I think for a lot of the kind of big kind of podcasts, that there's like a big kind of, not a big team, but there's a production team essentially. So you've got folk cutting it, you've got folk editing it, sound, all these kind of things. This is you by yourself, right? And I think when you kind of amass the kind of listenership that you have, both in terms of kind of like numbers and like essentially geographical reach, there's an element of pressure there. And you're no different to anyone else, right? You'll turn up, do this, like you say, you'll have those things that kind of pain you about it, those kind of internal fears, and I think it's kind of closely related to what you said, or what we were kind of chatting about earlier in the week, in terms of it's important to kind of remind ourselves what we find worth suffering for, because nothing is going to be milk and honey like 24/7, right? There's always going to be an element of pain, and I think it's important to kind of recognize that, right? Like nothing's going to be plain sailing, and I think those times that you do experience that pain or that kind of anxiety about it is reminding yourself that it's worth it. Like that's part of the journey, right? It's part of the process. That's what makes the success even sweeter, right? If you're not kind of suffering through it, you can't necessarily appreciate the good times. So yeah, I think it's important to remind yourself of that as well.
Yeah, I think there's two things there from the like anxiety piece as well, because anxiety is so profound now, isn't it? Where, not just even from like messages from listeners, but we talk about it in just everyday life. And I think, anxiety is always going to exist, and you can choose how you use it. You can choose how it turns up in your life as well. And, there's anxiety from, turning up and doing a podcast and, committing to that and having the fear of, or even the resistance, about, right, I'm not gonna do it today because I'm gonna do a few other things or whatever. That creates anxiety. So when you don't do it, it creates anxiety, but there's also the anxiety of the resistance that you're facing as well. So it's like what we were saying the other day, where you're like, when you choose a certain, or you make a certain decision about your life or what you're doing, you're sacrificing something else, you're choosing something else. So you're choosing that suffering. And it's the same with the anxiety. You're choosing what type of anxiety you get. Classic sport analogy, but it's before a game. People don't think about the anxiety you have before a game. You just turn up, you go and do it, but it's like, it'd be easier to turn away and just not do it. Same with work after work's not great all the time, but you turn up and you have a good day's work and you feel good, you feel engaged, but like maybe before going to work you didn't feel like it as well.
See, it's easier said than done, though, isn't it? It's one of those things, like in retrospect you can kind of look back and kind of make these comments and stuff, but yeah, in the moment it's tough. But like I said, it's one of those things that it does make you appreciate the end result, knowing that you've had to suffer to an extent to get there. So yeah, just important to kind of important to kind of be constantly aware of that, I think.
Yeah, and seeing the benefits that it can bring as well. I think this is maybe a bit more too much of a generalization, but I think there is anxiety that exists more now of having not done things. Do you know? I think from it's really, really tough to be concise about this and to be really specific, but by choosing not to do something, you are making a decision anyway. But the feeling that comes from that can, make you feel really bad about yourself, do you know? And I think that can be quite a self-fulfilling prophecy where you didn't do it, you feel bad about yourself and anxious that you didn't do it, and then you feel bad and you always think about that. So even when it comes to the next side of things, you're always thinking about that last thing that you did. So it's like that constant cycle. And even if you do make that brave decision to take that next step, that you're always going to think about the last time that you did. And you could have always been a bit better. But we're human.
I think, like, I don't know if I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I think this and we speak about this a lot. I know we're very like anti this kind of like hustle culture, but I think this kind of culture that exists, especially on Twitter, it does kind of make you, not me personally, because I can kind of feel like I can kind of like see through it a wee bit, more so now than I did in the past. But I think this kind of hustle culture that we see does make us kind of think, if we're not doing X, Y, Z, that we're a failure. You know what I mean? And it's so far from the truth. But because it's so prominent online, it's very easy to get kind of wrapped up in that. If I'm not doing this, then
but it feeds the subconscious.
I'm falling behind, and it does. Yeah, it's toxic.
And your brain doesn't know what's right and what's wrong. It's just producing like feelings from that, and it's not right and wrong's like not strong enough. It doesn't know if it's true or false. So your mind is genuinely like, oh, I must be doing this because this is what I'm reading, listening to, watching. Yes. Therefore, it's so objective in here that your mind, because you don't do it, you're then filling all of this negative emotion into your mind. It actually brings me really nicely onto something that we were thinking about before as well, and I think this is maybe a bit of a like moment for me as well, like realization around like simpler living. Like loads of stuff I push, not just from the mindset thoughts that I push out on the podcast each week, but I think it's mirroring or reflecting why I live so simply, why I push simple living so much, because you need that time and space to breathe and think. If I'm doing all this self-improvement and inner work, then you need time to completely decompress. And I think, like what you were just saying there around this hustle culture around work, and COVID's been a bit of a blessing and a curse with this as well, where 4 years ago working from home was so rare, but because people have had a taste of it, there is an element of more decompression there, which means that actually filling your time and filling your headspace with just really calming things, just having that time to go for a walk, having that time to just cook or watch telly or play video game. Do you know what? Like whatever suits you, like having that time to breathe and live simply without that expectation and pressure on yourself. I vividly remember before COVID not having any time. That's why I probably didn't do the podcast, because it's just push all the time. And this simpler living side of things is something that I'm starting to gain perspective of. I do it and I feel like it comes across in the podcast and people want it. That's my kind of connection.
Yeah, I think it kind of ties quite nicely into what you were saying in the newsletter this morning. In terms of like leaning into what makes you happy, what makes our life better. And it is, I think you said something like it's a gift when you realize things that make you feel good, and these things can change over time. Like you said, you probably didn't have the time to kind of do these kind of things prior to kind of COVID, and now we're kind of I guess out of it. I don't even know. Honestly, I've not been keeping track for it on the news, but yeah, now we're kind of like through the worst of it, I should say. It is kind of like got to the point where you've had that time. There's things that you do now that you might not have done before that bring you a lot of joy, and it is leaning into that. It's leaning into things that make you happy in the moment, and I think it's one of those things. Like happiness is not a destination, right? Like you'll never get to a point where you're like, right, I have X, Y, Z, I'm happy. Because when you get there, you won't be happy. You'll constantly be yearning for that next thing. And kind of touching on what I've said earlier is just appreciating those kind of small things, I think, in the moment, appreciating them for what they are. And I think it's being confident enough in yourself to kind of, say that that's what makes you happy. There's things that I do now, like very kind of like mundane things, I should say, that bring me a lot of joy that I never would have like thought about, like 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So, whether it's, like kind of cutting back on like drinking, that was something I never considered, but makes me really happy now. I'm going to out myself with this one, but even like, I've said to you, like, I find a lot of joy in kind of things like plane spotting, really kind of like simple things that I never would have thought before. And it's kind of like you just kind of have to be like unabashedly, confident in saying, right, like this is what makes me happy. But yeah, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent from your kind of like simple living thing, but it's important to kind of make that time for yourself, right? I think especially, just given work, given external pressures, whether that's like uni, anything, is taking that time to just kind of like reconnect with yourself a wee bit, I think.
Yeah, and I think, there's so many different things and factors that can contribute to that as well. We've used COVID as an example, but even just stage of life, phases of life, experiences, different jobs, different relationships, all of these things feed how you feel about things. And, it's about finding those things that are all encompassing with that simpler living, that are meditative, that are calming, that bring you joy specifically. There's definitely a shift in mindset that happens where it's not about living up to the expectations of other people, of trying to stay in the crowd. It's about, right, I'm comfortable in my own skin now. And it's not that you know what makes you happy, but you're comfortable exploring things that aren't popular, that again, we're joking about supplements before we come on the call being specific for your own genetic setup. It's the same with things that you enjoy as well.
That comes with age though, doesn't it? Like, and that's not to say that either of us are kind of like old and wise. Like we're both still young. But I've definitely noticed a shift like over the past kind of like, I would say like 5, 6 years, like probably from like my mid-20s to my early 30s. Huge shift. And it's things like, just things that come to you during the day. Like you might be in the shower and just have like a little thought, and it's like connecting with that thought, right? It's like, you'll be brushing your teeth and thinking, oh, this brings me joy. Like, I'm comfortable, whether people, think it's cool, whether it's like, socially kind of, I don't know if acceptable is the right word, but just it's being confident and comfortable in your own skin and being comfortable with what brings you joy. And I think leaning into that is massively important. And there was someone, I can't recall who said it, but I remember this quote. I think I'd read it on like a newsletter or something. It might have been Ramit Sethi, that said it, but he was talking about like living your rich life, and he was essentially saying that we should kind of like reframe how we view rich life, right? So I think a lot of people naturally, you would think rich and you would think finance, you'd think like material kind of possessions, but he said it's a case of reframing that to kind of focus on just general things that make you happy, so splurging on those things and completely diving into it. So whether that's I don't know, like the gym, like if you really enjoy going to the gym, you might be paying a little bit extra for that like nicer gym, or like extra kind of facilities, things like that. And it's redefining richness, right? And just going all in, because I think a lot of people will, myself included, you yearn for more money and kind of what that might bring, but you do kind of forget the things that make your life rich outside of finance, and you've got the ability to go all in on them, right? It's just a case of, I guess, like being aware of it and kind of making the most of it.
Yeah, I think that even provokes thought around like changing the term and definition of what rich is. Do you know? And it's a complete flip from the mindset of keeping up with the Joneses, isn't it? Like people think that a rich life is I have enough finance to keep up with everyone else in my social sphere, but rich actually might be, and again, it's maybe a bit of a cliche, but it's having time to do what you want or freedom to do what you want, whatever you want to define it as. But like for me, as an example, richness for me, I start work at 11 a.m. Richness for me is getting up early enough so that I can have a good cup of coffee, I can go for a big walk, and I can do a podcast and maybe a bit of writing or reading before I go to work. Like for me, that is richness. That's rich life. That's whatever you want to use as defining that. And none of it is involving finance. Do you know?
Exactly. It's that golden hour. I'm the same. It's that kind of time, like when you wake up early in the morning, kind of sun. Maybe
Clear
not the
mind.
sun. Maybe not the sun because we're in the UK, right? But if the sun's out, that's a bonus. But it's waking up in the morning, like having that kind of time to yourself, But it's just sitting down, like fresh cup of coffee, just like silence, like reading a book, like watching news, whatever. Like I love that little kind of like time period in the morning where it's like just you. And to me, that is rich. Going to the gym, like going all in on the gym, like whether that's supplementation, whether that's like extra facilities, like making the most of the facilities, whatever. That is rich. There's a good. It's funny we're kind of talking about it because I was speaking to my girlfriend about this like Bob Marley quote that I saw the other day. It wasn't a quote. It was like an interview. I saw it on YouTube, and the presenter was talking to Bob Marley. And he said something like, "Are you a rich man?" And like Bob Marley said something along the lines of like, "What do you mean rich?" And he was like, "Oh, like you've got money in the bank, you got millions in the bank." And he was like, "That's not richness to me. Like richness," and I'm paraphrasing here, but he was referring to like family, friends, like relationships, all these kind of things. And yeah, it's that redefinition. But I think in the kind of culture that we live in, you spoke on like keeping up with the Joneses and stuff. It's very, very easy to get sucked into that, and I say this again, I'm not immune to it. I feel it time to time. You feel that kind of comparison fatigue with other people, especially on social media. But just when I saw that quote, like that's definitely stuck with me. The kind of redefining your kind of rich life, and I love that. So
I think we could talk about so many examples, and it's so nice that we both have not just the awareness of it, but we have the like confidence and comfort within ourselves to be like, yeah, that's what we enjoy doing, and it doesn't need to be this big flashy thing. And I think if I think back to when I was at uni and I got to go to uni 4 or 5 days a week. I got to play football, like probably games twice a week. I got to train every other day. Like at that time in my life, that was a rich life, do you know? And, it's just really nice to reflect upon that and think, for someone that's listening to this about not just 3 years of the podcast, but actually being able to take away, right, what does that look like to me? What do I enjoy doing? Do I need to be more comfortable in my own skin? Do I need to be more confident in myself and my personality and what I enjoy to be able to do that as well? And the nice thing as well is that, like everything, it's always evolving. I talked to you about molding, sculpting things, just like this podcast, where, there's that never ending goal that means over an end. You are that person, you turn up and identify as that each and every day. And I think, it's important to own that as well. There's a lot of hiding and self-deprecation around, oh yeah, I do that, but we don't need to talk about that because that's just me. But it's like, no, own it. Like we obviously joke a lot about me going to watch lower league Scottish football. That is terrible.
Yeah.
But it makes me really happy being able to stand in that corner and fight for the fact that I'm not paying like 30 or 40 quid to go and watch a game where it's less entertaining than one I can go and watch for a fiver.
Yeah, I know. It's just making me chuckle. Like those 57 messages that you sent in WhatsApp yesterday without anyone replying, and you were just chatting about
just bleeding passion.
The Scottish Cup semi-final. I don't think anyone else was watching it. But yeah, just that kind of that joy. Like it's easy to kind of laugh about, right? But when you do kind of think about it, yeah, it's a beautiful thing to kind of just be able to go all in on something and just really enjoy it. But yeah, made me
like
chuckle.
I'm like really confident here in saying that definitely 80% of folk don't feel like that.
No,
it is the anomaly.
I don't know if it's something. I don't know if it's something you can like push necessarily though. Like and I mean, this is just me saying that from like my own perspective. Like it's time. It just comes out like over time. It's never something I thought, I need to like work hard on this. It's just come out. And yeah, it's tough. It's hard. It's hard to kind of like tell people to do it right. But when you find it, it's great.
Yeah, brilliant. Definitely a like self-discovery process.
Yes,
but
yeah. 100%.
I guess there's a lot of like, I guess my angle here is the perspective and perception that we have potentially from society, potentially socially, that there's an expectation.
Yeah.
That's unspoken potentially or unwritten. Yeah.
It definitely is.